You guys all look tired. Yeah? Thanks for sitting there, Nicole. I felt like there just was like this empty spot over there. Thanks for filling that spot. Yep. That's a good spot so I can look over there. As, you know, yeah, they gotta find someone to look at the side. If there's nobody back there, I can't look over there. You turn that down a little bit. It's a little hot mic. Head nod? Okay. Just don't laugh. I get sad and scared. Hey, we are going through a new series, right? A new, just 4 weeks, because it's kind of cool. Jonah's a pretty short book, 4 chapters. So we just want to make it easy for you. 4 weeks, 4 chapters, and we're going to go through that. Tyler must have been reading my notes, because this idea of running, that whole idea of the fact that God runs after us, because I think for us, we probably, more than not, would probably be honest with ourselves that we run not to where God would have us, but we run away. And so tonight we're in this book of Jonah, and I titled our message, Run, Jonah, Run, in homage to Forrest Gump, right? Run, Forrest, Run. And we're going to kind of look at that. But this book of Jonah, how many of you guys have heard the story of Jonah before? Okay, maybe the opposite. I think it's probably one of the most retold stories in probably all the Bible, because it's the great Sunday school story. Maybe for you it was like the VeggieTales story, right? You heard, VeggieTales and Jonah from the, it's in your kids' Bible. It's like one of those like, it's like Hall of Fame. Like, yes, we got to read Jonah because of what? Because of a fish, right? Do you realize the book of Jonah has 48 verses, and of the 48 verses, only 3 deal with this giant fish. So there's 45 other verses that we're going to unpack as we go through this series, and I hope we don't just get caught in this idea that Jonah is only about a fish, because there's so much more that I know is so practical and relevant for us today, just as it was when this story was written, or not story, this book was written about Jonah. So Jonah was a prophet, right? Jonah was given this call to go and share about Jesus, about the gospel to all those around that he was called to. And the thing that's crazy about this is it's one of the only prophetic books that has very little about the words that Jonah says and more about the story of his life. Kind of the ups and downs, the roller coaster that he goes on. And it's kind of it's a fun way to see him kind of do one thing and get a little bit slapped in the face, and then end up watching where God turns him and how he ends up in the end. But there's other books of the Bible that have stories about prophets. Isaiah, Ezekiel, and a lot of times those prophets, and actually prophets all over the Bible, they struggle. They have tough times. But Jonah is literally the only prophet who not only struggles, but he runs away. He totally turns and goes the opposite direction that God was calling. So for us, and I hope that you take some time to put yourself maybe in Jonah's shoes, or the other examples we look at tonight, to say, am I going to struggle like Jonah did? Am I going to run like Jonah did? Or will I actually stop and learn how to be a better follower of Christ? And that's my prayer, that as we go through this all, that you don't just go, well, it was a cool story, but no, how do I take this message and apply it to my life? How do I live differently because I look at a guy like Jonah and I look at his struggles, and I look also the big picture of who God is, and how God's the God of second chances, and God's the God that wants to come back and actually take you out of a tough situation and redeem it. So we're going to look at struggles, we're going to look at a calling, we're going to look at disobedience, we're going to look at problems, we're going to look at prayer as we go through this book of Jonah. So we're going to jump right in, and like we should, right? We're going to start at chapter 4 and go backwards. Actually, no, we're not. We're going to start at chapter 1 because we start at the beginning, and it works well that way, to kind of get the idea of what's happening. And so we jump into this guy named Jonah. Right? And we see the first thing that you guys can put in your notes, that Jonah runs, or he's running from God's mission. God gives him a mission and he runs from it. So if you have your Bibles, we'll look at Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. It says this. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord. Stop right there. So this guy Jonah, okay, like I said, he's a prophet. He was given a mission by God to go and share and to preach to all different kinds of people groups. And in this case, he says, hey, you know what? You're going to go to the city of Nineveh. You're going to preach against it. So first of all, we need to figure out that Jonah was a real person. It says here that Jonah was a son of Amittai. Or Amittai, whichever way you want to say it, I don't know. You can make it all up. And you will never know the difference, because I don't know the difference. But he's a real person. And Tyler shared a parable tonight, talking about the lost sheep. And some people, they kind of attack the story going, oh, it's just a fable, it's just a parable, just a story that wasn't really true. And I want to attack that and say that no, this guy Jonah was a real person. And we know he's a real person because when we historically look at some of the people that the Bible talks about, in 2 Kings, it talks about all these different guys. And it talks about that it was a king named Jeroboam. And we're looking at verse 23. And it says that Jeroboam the king of Israel was the king of Samaria. And he reigned 41 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. He was one that restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo, Hamath, and to the Dead Sea, in accordance to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet of Gath-hepher. So we get all these names going on. Well, historically, when you look back at historical records, there was really a king named Jeroboam. Israel was a real nation. Hamath was a real place. And so Jonah, who was called in 2 Kings, he was not a figment of an imagination. No, he was a real person. So we need to follow and look at this book of Jonah as a real story that really happened. Because, yeah, it can look a little bit far-fetched. We talk about a great fish swallowing this guy in the sea. But it's more than that. It's truly a real story of how God worked in one man's life. And how the man's disobedient led him one way and God brought him back. So we need to understand it's a real story. It really happened. And Jonah was a real man, and he was chosen to speak. It says there in the first verse, right, the word of the Lord came to Jonah. I don't know how, whether it was through a vision, through a dream, through just, man, I just feel like I need to go. Whatever reason, God speaks to this guy Jonah and says, hey, here's the deal. I'm going to give you a mission. Here's your job. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to this great city of Nineveh and preach against it. It's all he knew. It's all he was supposed to do. Now, we realize that Jonah must have been close to God if God speaks to him, if God talks to him. And he goes, hey, here's your mission. My call on you, your commission to you, is to go and preach against the city of Nineveh. Now, we need to learn a little bit about the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was a great city. Like all over in Jonah, it says, like, go to the great city of Nineveh, not to the backwoods city or the little small city or the little podunk city, whatever. No, it was the great city of Nineveh. So historically in this time, Assyria was one of the giant powerhouses of this area, right, of the Middle East. And Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and it was located in a very pristine place, a very prominent place on the Tigris River because it was important. And it was a growing power. And so as Israel grew, it would have come against, one of the borders would have been against Assyria. And it was pretty much a big, huge threat against Israel. So some have said that the population of Nineveh would have been about 600,000 people. It was huge. It was a great city. It was about 1,800 acres, and it had 15 great gates. It was all kinds of major, massive area that the city of Nineveh was. It was said that the walls could have been up to 100 feet tall, and they were wide enough that 3 chariots could have raced side by side. So it was a big city. It was a great city. It was a powerhouse city. And not only was it great, it was greatly wicked. And so Jonah is given this message by God to go and preach against this great, wicked city of Nineveh. the word of the Lord came to Jonah. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Verse 3, but Jonah ran away from the Lord. He was given a mission, but he ran away. He ran the opposite direction. I don't know if you have ever actually thought about running away. I don't think I ever truly had that moment where, like, I have to run away, my home is so bad. But there's certain situations that I wanted to run away from. There's people that I want to run away from. It's this idea that, like this little boy, the story that I heard about, this little 5-year-old boy is walking down the street, and his neighbor is sitting there, and he's got his little suitcase, and he's walking past her, and she's mowing her lawn, and she walks in front of his house and turns the corner, and about 5 minutes later, like, there he is again, walking in front of her house, and turns the corner, and about 5 minutes later, he walks in front of her house, and she stops him, and she says, well, what are you doing? He's like, I'm running away. Well, how come you keep coming back? Well, because my mom and dad said I couldn't cross the street. See, we kind of get to that point where we want to run away, but should we really run away? And we have these reasons we don't, but Jonah didn't have any reason. He really wanted to run away, and he really does run away. And as much as things get tough, do we ever get to that point where we really, literally run in the opposite direction? See, we may give Jonah gets a bad rap because he ran away. But there are so many people in the Bible that have taken this same idea and ran away. We start off in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. Adam and Eve come to this spot where they disobey God, and what do? They run away and they hide. Or Moses, if you're following with us in the main services in River Valley, we're going through Exodus, and we're watching the story of Moses unfold, and Moses kills this soldier, and all of a sudden he runs away. He hides, he goes away. Or we heard the story of David and Goliath, right? David kills Goliath, so awesome, and then later Saul is chasing him and he runs away. Or how about this? We really love the disciples who follow Jesus, who walk with Jesus, and at one point, when Jesus is captured, they don't stand there. What do? They run away. So just because Jonah runs away, man, we can't totally discount it, because we probably, a lot of times in our lives, we do the same thing, that we run away. Jonah was running from God's mission. Not only does he run from his mission, but on top of that, he runs from his enemies. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went on board and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So we literally see Jonah was supposed to go east. Okay, so where he was, his hometown, Gath-Happer was the place it was. If he would have gone to Nineveh, he would have gone east. But instead, it says that he goes down and he gets on this ship, and he literally is going to go west. It's like someone saying, hey, your mission is to go to New York City, and instead you find yourself on the Pacific coast, and you're ready to go the completely opposite direction. You're going to get on a boat and go to Hawaii. And that's what Jonah does. He goes the opposite direction. So we know that Nineveh was great, but it also said that Nineveh was wicked. And Nineveh's wickedness was actually known throughout the whole Middle East. And some of the things that would have meant these were his enemies for Jonah, was just to hear some of these stories about what the Assyrians would do, what these people who lived in Nineveh would do. These shocking brutalities. So just some of them. They would cut off the heads of the enemy soldiers when they captured them, and they would just stack piles of heads outside the city. When they would capture the people they would attack, they would capture them, they would skin them, and they would hang the skin on the walls of the city. They would torture their prisoners by cutting off their hands and taking out their organs and gutting them. One of the things they would love to do is they would love to go out into the desert, take a captive, and they would dig a hole and they would bury this captive up to his neck. Leave him alive, but bury him in the sand, in the desert, up to his neck. And he wouldn't die immediately, and actually they would say that most of the time they would go insane before they would actually die. The heat and the exposure would actually take them out. They would burn infants and women alive. They would stack skulls up as decoration. This is a powerful and godless nation. And this is who God says, your mission is to go preach against that city. When we look at other places in the Bible, in Nahum, another book later in the Old Testament, it talked about the sexual deviancy and the grossness and the brutality and the complete and totally godlessness of this city. It was actually, in that book, Nahum, it says that Nineveh was a city of blood. So here we see that Jonah is called to go and preach against that city. It'd be like today, if you were called to go, it'd be like to go against Nazi Germany. Go against guys like Hitler and Stalin or Saddam Hussein, to go against like genocide. That would be how bad and wicked this is where Jesus or God calls Jonah to go. So why would he run from his enemies? I mean, first of all, just to look at the wickedness that is there, yeah, it's going to be a dangerous place to go. He was probably afraid, but I think it's more than he had fear for his safety. Now, the reason he was really running from his mission and running from his enemies was he didn't want God to work. So check this out. He knew that God is an amazing God. And if he would go and preach against the city of Nineveh, he knew that God would probably save them. And he didn't want these enemies of his to find that God was a good God. No, he wanted them to be destroyed. So in running from his enemies, he was actually saying, I want God to destroy them. I don't want God to save them. So Jonah runs from God's mission. He runs from his enemies. Jonah goes in a complete opposite direction that God had been calling him to. He was definitely out of God's will. God had a call for him, and he said, forget it, I'm going to do my own thing, I'm going to go my own way. And so because he runs from God's mission, and because he runs from his enemies, he runs into a lot of consequences. In verse 4, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors who were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went down to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish. So Jonah gets on this ship in Joppa, and I picture him getting on the ship, and like you see all the cruise ship people. Has anyone gone on a cruise before? And okay, I haven't either, but I've seen movies. And you see the people that go on the cruise ship, and they all wave to the people like, yeah, see you later. I'm going to go have a good time, and you're not. So I think Jonah kind of does that. Like, I did it, I got away, I'm on the boat, I'm all right. And he goes down. He's so comfortable that he goes down below deck and he goes to sleep. Pretty good. But then what happens? The consequences start. The difficulties start. It says that a great wind begins to blow. Now when you sail, yes, you need some wind, right? Wind pushes the sails that makes you go. Pretty good thing. You need some of that. But the more the wind blows, it actually says it threatens to break up the ship. It's gonna cause it to tear in 2 or 3 or 500. And I was thinking, if you were a sailor and you sailed on the sea, you would know that, man, I understand storms. I understand like what happens when the wind gets blowing. But this must have been so much worse than normal, because it says that all the sailors start to freak out. They're terrified by how violent the storm is. So it's not the normal storm that they would have seen. No, it's much more. It's more violent. It's more deadly. And it's this terrifying for all the people involved except Jonah. Jonah thinks he's got away with leaving what God had called him to. And sometimes we do that. We're like, yep, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to go my own way, and it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. I'm going to be on a cruise ship, and it's going to be great. He's able to go down and sleep in the bottom of the ship when this violent storm begins. But the sailors, they're dealing with something a little bit different. It says that they begin to throw everything overboard to lighten the load of the ship. And then they cry out to their own gods. It's the little g gods because it's just their gods. They think it's going to save them, but it doesn't. So they finally realize that, man, we better go talk to this guy, Jonah. So the captain goes down, right? He's gone below deck, and the captain comes and says, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice and say, we will not perish. Jonah thinks he's okay, but everyone else realizes they're not. He's sleeping while they're all weeping. He's oblivious to anything that's going on, and he has to get called out. Here's the thing to stop and think about. That whatever we think we know best, whenever we think we should do what's good for us, when we're doing something that's selfish in our eyes, guess what? God always knows where we are. God is always watching us, whether it's in the bottom of a ship or wherever else we think we can hide. So God's watching, and sometimes we try to hide from God. We try to keep our sin or our issues that we're dealing with, we try to keep it to ourselves, or we think we can outrun God. We can go farther and faster than what He's going to be able to see. But that's not the case, because God's the Almighty God. And God always knows what's going on. He always knows where we are. He knows Jonah. He knows where Jonah is. And as Jonah runs from God, God goes, I'm right here. I control the violent wind. Sometimes we think that, well, my disobedience, because see, all this that Jonah's running is all disobedience. Basically putting his ideas in front of God's and completely doing the opposite that God wants him to do. So his disobedience is leading to these circumstances, leading to these issues that are happening in his life. And actually, sometimes we think that it's only going to affect me. But what happens here is it affects all the sailors, all the people on this ship are in the same storm. And we think that it's only me that's going to have to deal with it. No, but the sins of our life, the things that we do as disobedience, will affect other people as well. So the sailors try to figure out what's going on. They actually ask Jonah. We look a little farther here. He says, what have we done? Look at verse 9. Verse 9 says this. They ask him who he is. The sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity. They cast lots, and the lots fell on Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. This terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? They knew that he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. I think it's so interesting that at some point, Jonah's probably bragging about the fact he's like, yeah, I'm running away from God. Like, for whatever reason, he tells all the sailors, all the people on board, that he's like, I'm doing the opposite of what God had called me to do. And now they know why all these consequences are happening. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to make this sea calm down for us? Jonah says in verse 12, pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will be calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Verse 13, instead the men did their best to row back to the land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. They cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing this innocent man. For you, Lord, have done as you pleased. They took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. They ask, what have you done? At this point, not only does Jonah know he's running from God, but all the sailors now know, yes, the reason this all happened is because Jonah's running from God. And the way they figure out how we do this, they cast lots. They basically gamble to say, I'm not saying that you gamble to figure out why things happen to you, but Jonah knows it's his fault, and they gamble and it points to Jonah, and they all realize, okay, we got to do something. And Jonah says, here's the deal. Throw me into the sea, and the sea will grow calm. Get rid of me, and it will not go bad for you. He wants to take it. He wants to take himself out. He's probably at this point going, all right, I realize I ran the wrong way. I ran against God's mission. I ran away from my enemies. Just get me out of the picture, and it'll all be okay. The sailors didn't want that to be the answer, though. They actually says that they tried to row in the opposite direction. They tried to row back to land. They still wanted to fix it on their own. Right? They tried to fix it by climbing to their own little G-gods. And now they try to fix it by rowing back to land. And God's like, nope, it's not going to work. You can row all you want, but I'm going to make the wind be stronger. I'm going to make the storm be rougher. And we can try to fix our problems on our own too. And I'm one of those people that tries so hard to do everything right. And I try to do so hard to make things right on my own power. And at some point, I'm glad that God keeps making storms that I can't fix on my own. And so with Jonah here, he can't fix it. The sailors can't fix it. And so the final part of his disobedience was that he was thrown into the sea. That he was thrown overboard. And it says immediately, right? As they took Jonah and threw him overboard, the raging sea grew calm. See, the final consequence of the disobedience of Jonah was that he was thrown into a sea. That he was thrown overboard, that he was basically left for dead. The mission started with a call to go to Nineveh. He ran from the mission, he ran from his enemies, and he ends up, the part of the story that most people know, the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. Jonah runs from God's mission, he runs from his enemies, he runs into consequences, and now he's sitting in the belly of a giant fish. Well, we'll unpack that as we continue the story, but that's not it. That's not what we want to stop. That's not what we'll look at, because we can do two things. We can just look at the story and really learn what not to do. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm going to learn what not to do from somebody else. Okay? And we can learn a lot of things not to do by listening to Jonah, to looking what Jonah did. But I actually want to look at the anti-Jonah. Look at somebody who didn't disobey, who didn't run away from God's mission, who didn't run away from his enemies, who did the exact opposite of all that Jonah did, and that's the person of Jesus. See, Jesus is the anti-Jonah. Jonah ran away, or ran from God's mission, where Jesus ran to God's mission. Jesus was given a mission, and he took it and he ran with it. In Luke chapter 4, verse 14, it says this, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. The news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue. It was the custom, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of prophet Isaiah was handed him. Unrolling it, he found a place where it was written this, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoner, to recover sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus took that call to be his mission, to proclaim good news, to proclaim freedom for the prisoner, to set the oppressed free. Jesus was given a mission, and he took it, and he ran to it. In Luke 19, verses 9 and 10, and verse 10 says this, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." That was his mission, to seek and save the lost. And he didn't run from it, he ran to it. And that's what he lived, that's how he lived. Let's follow that example. Not only did he run to God's mission, but he ran to his enemies. Matthew 5, verses 43 through 48, it says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise in the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect." Jesus ran to his enemies. Jesus loved his enemies. Jesus served his enemies. He prayed for his enemies. It wasn't natural. It's really easy for us to love those who love us back. It's really easy for us to serve those who serve us. But Jesus is saying, no, I want you to go love and serve those who hate you, who are those who are opposing you. To follow the mission and the fact that Jesus ran to those people. He ran to God's mission. He ran to his enemies. He loved them. He served them. He actually gave his final breath for them. Luke 23 verses 24 or 34 says, he actually prayed for his enemies on the cross as he was dying. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." He cared so much for those who had put him on the cross that he said, "Forgive them." To be different, to not be like everyone else in our world, he loved those who hated him. In Romans 5:10, we read this, it says, "Christ died for his enemies." Right? Verse 10 says, "For if we, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" See, we were God's enemies, and God reconciled us through his death. Through his death on the cross, we are alive. We have life. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus ran to God's mission. He ran to his enemies, and he ran into opportunities. He wanted to do what God had planned for him. He didn't run into consequences, into problem situations. No, he ran into the opportunities that God gave. He looked for opportunities to teach, to heal, to love, to change people's lives. And there's one group in the story of Jonah in chapter 1 that I think got this opportunity. And that was the sailors. See, the sailors start off where they're just doing their own thing. They try their own little g gods. They try to figure out how they can fix the situation. And then what happens is they throw Jonah overboard. And in verse 15 it says this. They took Jonah, they threw him overboard into the raging sea grew calm. Verse 16. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows to him. These sailors who only knew their own little gods end up finding the real God. They see, it says that they greatly feared the Lord. And we know from the Bible it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We begin to understand how amazing, how awesome, how mighty this big God is. And these sailors started that. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord. They made vows to him. They said, man, I want what that God has. I want him. I'm going to make my vow to serve him, to live for him. They had these little gods, but they exchanged that for the real, true God. They follow him. They have a vow for him. Jonah's disobedience led these sailors to find God. What about us? Where are we at? What is it going to take for us to find more of God? Are we going to be like Jonah and have to go through disobedient times, go through consequences? Or are we going to be like Jesus and take the mission that God has given us and follow it and run to our enemies and love our enemies and look for the opportunities that He has? We can run to our mission or we can run from it. We can run from our enemies or we can run to them. We can try to be selfish or we can be selfless. Whose example will we follow? Follow the example of Jonah or follow the example of Jesus? I think it's cool that as Jonah disobeys, his disobedience leads him to sit for 3 days in the belly of a fish. When we look at Jesus, Jesus stayed 3 days in the belly of a grave, not because of His disobedience, but because of ours. See, Jesus took our disobedience and He died for that disobedience. And he stayed 3 days in a grave to give us life. Jonah's going to stay alive in the belly of a fish. But I'm glad that Jesus came back to life in the belly of a grave because it gave me life. And if you're here and you're going, man, I want that kind of life, or I want this idea of what is God's mission for me, I would just ask that you take the time to ask somebody about that. Whether it's asking me or your staff or your small group leader or maybe the person that you came with. Maybe you've never thought about the idea that God gave us a mission. And maybe you're like Jonah, that we're just running in the opposite direction. Don't run anymore. Don't run west when God calls you east. Run to God, not from Him. Let's pray. God, I thank You for this picture of Jonah. I thank You for this reminder of what, God, You called him to, You called Jonah to, and he ran away. God, I would pray that we would be people that when we hear Your voice, when we hear Your call in our life, we would not run from that mission, but God, we would run to it. God, I thank You for the example of Jesus Christ, who was never disobedient, who His obedience led to death on the cross, that He died for our disobedience. He died for Jonah's disobedience. He died because He wanted us to live. And I pray that if there's students here tonight in this room that are struggling, what does it mean to live a life for You, that they would ask someone about it. God, would they not go one more day running in the wrong direction, but would they run to You? Would they run to Your mission? Would they run to the opportunity to put their life in Your hands? I pray these things in Your name.